Hello, this is Jeff Peterson with UV Technology Magazine, the official publication of RadTech North America. Welcome to our UV Technology webinar series. Today we have Jennifer Heathcote with us, who is Vice President Business Development for GEW. And Jennifer today is going to talk about global initiatives driving sustainability policy and the growth of UV, LED, and EV curing. Before we get started real quick, everybody, all the attendees are on mute. So if you're interested in asking Jennifer a question as we're going through the webinar, there's a little chat button should be on the right side of your computer screen. You can hit that, type your question in, and then when we're completed, I'll come back on and repeat any questions that we have for Jennifer once she is done. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over and welcome Jennifer Heathcote.
Thank you, Jeff. I think this is a very important topic, and I'm absolutely thrilled. We had 159 people register for this webinar. That's incredible numbers, but what that tells me is that all of you are as equally confused about sustainability as I am. I don't think any of us really understand what's behind sustainability and where it's taking us. And you know, if we just think about how many sustainability policies are actually causing harm to the environment, if we think about how many sustainability policies are actually deindustrializing the modern world and making it ever so much more difficult for those of us on this webinar to actually conduct business. You know, and then there's policies, sustainable policies that are actually hurting the poor and destabilizing the middle class. And I don't want to believe that was the intended goal. And so if I look at sustainability as a whole, and this is not a direct reflection on anything that you or your company is doing, but if I look at the whole entirety of sustainability and I had to give it a grade, I probably would give it an F. You know, that's my personal opinion. You may have a completely different, take on that situation. And I give it an F, not because we aren't turning in our assignments. I think we're all actively working hard to do the right thing, but we're copying on the kid you're copying the kid next to us who doesn't understand it either. And we're just proliferating a lot of bad policy throughout the industry. And so is sustainability broken? I mean, my counter to that would be, I don't think it ever worked in the first place. So how do we right the ship? I don't think sustainability is wrong. I actually think it's a very good thing to do. I think it's very, very powerful. And so this slide deck has actually been evolving over the last 2 or 3 years. And it started because about 2 years ago, I began hearing about scope emissions. And I hadn't heard scope emissions before. And maybe some of you who are on this webinar knew about them long before I did. And maybe some of you are hearing it for the first time. But every couple of years, we're getting introduced to a new term. And the first thing I think of is, what is this? Where did it come from? Who's driving it? How long has it been around? So I started looking at the scope emissions. I tried to figure out, when net zero became a thing. What about ESG? What about sustainability? What's behind a lot of this? And so that kind of created this presentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a couple, definitional slides just to make sure that we're on the same page in terms of terminology. And then I'm going to give a very high level overview of key sustainability policy over the last few decades. And then I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into a few of those so that we can understand really what's driving a lot of this. And then I'm going to finish by concluding that I think UV, LED, and EB curing are the solution to a lot of what's needed in sustainability. And I think collectively as an industry, we're just not getting our message across. So that's kind of the plan for today. I'm going to try to stay on time. I know I always go a little bit long, but there's so much in my head that I want to share with you, and I just can't do it in an hour. So let's start with non-governmental organizations, or NGOs. This started creeping up in articles, in programming a lot more frequently over the last 5 years. And so I wanted to understand where the term NGO came from. And I was surprised that it actually dates back to 1945, when the United Nations wrote its charter. It wrote NGOs into its its documents with the intention that NGOs were meant to be not affiliated with any particular country, not a state affiliated organization. They were meant to be independent. They were meant to have a vision and a mission that was aligned with what the UN was trying to accomplish. And the intention was that they would serve as consultants to the United Nations. The United Nations would, approve certain NGOs with, consultancy status, and they would actually participate in writing policy and making decisions. So in 1945, the UN designated 41 NGOs with consultative status. By the end of 2022, there were 6,343 NGOs actively working with the United Nations. Now, in and of itself, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. The UN pays them for work. They provide, in some cases, free service, and then they implement the United Nations work in the field. The challenge is that a lot of this isn't transparent, and effectively what we have with sustainability policy is a lot of unelected bureaucrats and a lot of activist NGOs are writing the policy that then we in the business community are trying to understand and implement. So international treaties versus international agreements. So you can think of an international treaty as, kind of what we learn in school, right? We write a treaty to end a war, right? We write a treaty to provide mutual defense. NATO is a perfect example. Or we write a treaty because we're going to participate in some sort of construction project, the Panama Canal, right? So an international treaty typically is coordinated and drafted up with the State Department. The president gets involved, but then it has to be approved or ratified by 2/3 of the Senate. International agreements don't carry the same weight. They aren't typically approved by Congress. And again, I'm giving you the American perspective. I understand the American legal system much better than I understand Europe and the rest of the world. But in the US, the president of the United States can sign us into international agreements and sign us out of international agreements. And so a lot of the sustainable policy is what it's kind of promoted as international treaties. And there are other countries that treat them as international treaties, but they're more international agreements. They're soft policy, right? There's no sustainability police that's going around the world making sure that we're all, accountable. That said, the policy is working its way into each and every country and being adopted by each and every country in the way that they see fit, which then is legally binding within that particular nation. So emissions terminology, a lot of what sustainability is rooted in is emissions. I know we always want to talk about recyclability and compostability and reducing waste, and all those things are good and certainly part of it. But the root of sustainability is emissions, and it is greenhouse gases. And so greenhouse gases that we emit from our manufacturing processes and our day-to-day activities, they rise up into the troposphere where they trap heat and lead to an increasing temperature on Earth. Volatile organic compounds, you can think of this as pollution. We were really focused on VOCs, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. They're carbon-containing air pollutants, a precursor to the formation of ozone, and they can cause, a long list of, health effects to all of us. So VOCs, we want to reduce as much as possible. And then we have hazardous air pollutants, toxic air pollutants. Again, these are emitted from both natural and anthropogenic activities when we release them into the air, release them into water, and they have potential, adverse effects to human health and the environment. Today, the Environmental Protection Agency regulates 188 toxic air pollutants. So sustainability, let's just start with trying to understand, what it is. And first of all, sustainability is a construct. It's not really defined set of actions. It's an ideology, right? And as such, sustainability means different things to different people. You can kind of think of it as, community or democracy or justice or freedom or education. Those things in and of themselves are all great constructs to get behind, but how they're implemented, how each country decides to implement those, democracy in one country is often practiced very differently in another country. And so that is, at the end of the day, really what sustainability is. It's a construct, it's an ideology. And because there's no real true definition of it, it makes it very hard for all of us to understand how we can make our businesses more sustainable. So let's take a step back in time, and I'm just, I'm going to pick 1700s Europe just to kind of set the stage here. So this was the Enlightenment era, right? Science and logic were the prevailing, method of communication and investment in economics and art, and everything was improving, and life was getting better. Travel was there. People had access to food, so life was pretty good. We had, exploration. We were, sailing ships all over the world. We were bringing back new products and items to share. And so life was pretty good. And at the time, the main resource that was used, other than like stone, building materials, was wood. So wood was used to build carriages. It was used to build ships. It was used to build furniture. It was used to heat your home. It was used to cook your food. So wood was the really only fuel source available at the time. And for shipbuilding, it took 1.2 million oak trees to build 300 ships. So very quickly, what was happening, Europe in the 1700s, and actually this chart here takes you from 1000 BC to almost 2000 AD. So you can see, as the population grew, the use of trees was ever more necessary, and the forests, basically constricted, quite a bit, to the point where people were paying attention, and they said, look, our whole livelihood really depends on wood, and if we continue to cut down our forests, society will collapse. We can no longer heat our homes and cook our food and build ships. We're kind of stuck. And at the same time, as they were considering the economic perspective, they also looked at, the poor. When wood became scarce, not everybody had access to it, so the prices went up, right? It became very difficult, to secure, which meant the poor became even more impoverished because they could no longer, have wood for building materials or cook their food or heat their homes. And so my personal view is that sustainability is both rooted in preserving resources, managing resources correctly so that humans can, and the society that we know, the standard of living we know, can continue on in the future. But we have to do it in a way that we're also protecting the most vulnerable. Too much of what we're doing in sustainability today is actually making life for not only the poor, but the middle class and the upper middle class. It's making it very difficult for them to be, the same position in society that they had in the past. And so I think we need to right that ship. Sustainability for the sake of sustainability, if it's harming more people, I don't necessarily think is the direction that we should be going. So now I'm going to go into this, very high level timeline, and I'm going to do this a little bit quick because I'll talk about some of these policies in a little more detail in future slides. So all of this is being driven by the United Nations. If you think about, we fast forward from the 1700s to, let's say, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the environmental movement was focused on pollution and litter, right? We were trying to get rid of VOCs, hazardous air pollutions. We were tackling acid rain. We were trying to fix the hole in the ozone layer. We were trying to make sure that our waters and streams and our oceans were clean. We were picking up trash and litter and educating people that they shouldn't be, throwing down trash. And we were recycling. So once we got, into the 80s, we'd actually done a pretty good job. We were very successful at identifying the problems, the ones that I mentioned, figuring out the source of those problems, and following up with action. And so by the early 80s, the environmentalists had a positive impact on everything. And I'm grateful, for that. I was a child, in the 70s, but I'm grateful for the work that they did, because I like the fact that I can walk outside and we have clean air, and I have waters that are much more supportive of human life. We're still not going to drink them, but they're much cleaner. I mean, I live in Cleveland. They're certainly much cleaner today than what they were in the past. But then we got to the early 80s, and what happened is the environmental movement that had basically dominated the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s was completely hijacked by the climate change movement. I mean, completely hijacked. And initially it was all about global cooling, and then it became global warming, and now it's just climate change. So the UN, which was originally established for peacekeeping purposes and to prevent war, was actually terrible at its initial initiative, right? It was meant to stop war and it didn't. So it came into the scene in 1945 after the end of World War II, and yet we still had, the Korean War, we had the Vietnam War, they weren't good at keeping peace. So the UN reinvented itself. And in the 80s, the UN decided that it was going to focus on environment. So in 1987, the UN came out with a policy document called Our Common Future. And that was the first time that sustainable development was used in a document. And sustainable development, it's kind of a sensitive word in the sense that there's a lot of environmentalists that don't like this word, right? How do you have development that's sustainable? Any development is problematic, right? We want to preserve the earth, but sustainable development isn't the way to do it. So the UN kind of set the stage that we were going to focus on sustainable development. Development still means economic progress. Development still means growth. And they did this with Our Common Future. So then in 1988, the very next year, this is when the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was organized. And this was an association of scientists that were meant to review and analyze anything that they could get their hands on related to man-made climate change. And every 6 to 7 years, they were going to produce a report. If we've learned anything since 1988, if we've learned anything from these reports, is that we do not understand climate change. The models are continuously wrong. The targets that they predict are always wrong, and they keep moving the goalposts. Data has been manipulated. So climate is a very complex, it's not like pollution. Pollution we tackled, we haven't eradicated, but we managed pollution. Climate change is a whole nother ballgame. So in 1992, the UN hosts the Rio Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And out of this came Agenda 21, which was, again, all the NGOs that were participating. It was, all the bureaucrats from around the world that participate in the UN policy. They came up with Agenda 21. Most of it was written by NGOs and then just kind of gets signed off by the countries that are in attendance. But it was how the UN saw the world from a sustainability perspective by the year 2000. Now, almost nothing in Agenda 21 was accomplished. They didn't really have an enforcement mechanism. It was just kind of an idea of what the future needed to look like. They also came up with 2 other policy documents, again, managing the forest, environment and development, and then 2 recurring conventions, one on diversity and one on climate change. So the Convention on Climate Change occurs not annually. I think it's increasingly, in recent years, it's been more annually. But we're now up to, in November, we'll have the COP29, so Convention of the Parties in Azerbaijan. And so that'll be the 29th convention since the Rio Earth Summit. So in 1997, everybody heads off to Kyoto, Japan for the 3rd conference of the party. So this was COP3. And this is where the UN said, the whole purpose of sustainability is to reduce greenhouse gases. We're going to address climate change by reducing greenhouse gases, and everybody needs to get on board because we're tying greenhouse gases to climate change. After the Kyoto Protocol is when organizations, NGOs, tried to figure out, okay, now if we're going to target greenhouse gases, we need a way to measure them and account for them. So the Greenhouse Protocol, which is effectively Scope 1, 2, 3, and 4 emissions, that was launched in 2004 following the Kyoto Protocol. Now, just to kind of reiterate, the Kyoto Protocol is an international treaty. President Bush at the time did not sign it, and it was not ratified by the US Senate. So the US has never technically been on board with the Kyoto Protocol. And the main reason is that President Bush said that 80% of the countries didn't have to participate in it. And we didn't feel that we weren't willing to diminish our own economic interests when 80% of the world didn't have to participate either. So that's the main reason we didn't sign the Kyoto Protocol. So then in 2005, Kofi Annan, who was Secretary General of the UN, he wanted to find a way to get environmental and social governance into the lexicon, and he wanted to do it through the financial industry. So he tapped 20 individuals from 12 different countries, and backed that up with a 70-person team of NGOs and industry experts, and basically tasked them with coming up with some sort of a document, policy document, that they could roll out to the financial industry. And so they established the 6 key principles, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. So that was 2006. So then we get to 2015. So this is COP21. So this is another climate change conference of the parties, takes place in Paris. And this is where the Paris Agreement comes out. So the Paris Agreement expands on the Kyoto Protocol and basically draws a line in the sand and says that global warming will be limited if we can keep the temperature increase less than 2 degrees C by 2050. And while they didn't use the term net zero at the time, actually didn't come on to existence for a couple years until a couple years later, the concept of what came out of the Paris Agreement is that countries had to pledge to be net zero by 2050. And the UK was the first one to make that pledge, and they did it in 2019. So also what happened in 2015 is we had another UN General Assembly meeting, and that's where they took Agenda 21, which had basically never materialized into anything productive, and they rewrote it and they called it Agenda 30, with 30 meaning 2030. And then part of Agenda 30 is where we get written into that are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which we'll talk about in another slide as well. So then that brings us to recent years, 2018, 2022, 2024. Now you have national governments. I just took a sampling, the UK, the EU, and the US. I'm sure there's other countries out there that are doing this as well, but we don't have time to cover everybody, so I picked these 3. So what you're seeing is that countries are now writing greenhouse gas emissions reporting, which is scope 1, 2, and 3, into national policy, national legislation, regional legislation that requires many publicly traded and large private companies to start reporting greenhouse gases. So from the 80s, so from the 1980s up until 2024, if we just look, if we deem the UN as the arbiter of sustainability policy and what's sustainable and not sustainable, everything the UN is doing is telling us it's all about greenhouse gases. It's not that the other things we're doing in sustainability don't matter, but the metrics that we're increasingly being graded on, the metrics that your customers, your businesses, your products are being graded on is greenhouse gases. So let's go back to 2004 or even like 1997 with the Kyoto Protocol. Following the Kyoto Protocol, there were 2 NGOs that kind of raised their hand and said, let's combine forces and let's figure out a way to measure greenhouse gases. So they joined together and they created, so it was the World Resource Institute and the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. So they joined together and they formed yet another new NGO, and they called it a Greenhouse Gas Protocol. You can see the website link down at the bottom if you want to look into their history and who they are a little bit further. But the Greenhouse Gas Protocol defined in 2004 scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. Now, mind you, I was shocked to learn that this came back to 2004 because I'd only heard about it 2 years ago. And I think many of you have only heard about it within recent years, but this has been around for 20 years. Scope 1 is all of the emissions, specifically greenhouse gases, but also, VOCs and HAPs and TAPs that you're emitting directly from your facility during your operations. Scope 2 is purchased energy, whether that's electricity or steam or gas, it's anything that you're purchasing into your facility. And those 2 were created in 2004. Scope 3, which is your upstream and downstream supply chain, which is primarily, freight or, waste removal. That's scope 3. That didn't enter until 2011. And if you look down to the bottom right in that black box, those are the greenhouse gases in descending order. The largest greenhouse gas is water vapor, by far. Largest greenhouse gas, water vapor. It's followed by carbon dioxide, which is why we get focused on carbon footprint, because carbon dioxide, if we exclude water, because in 2004, no one wanted to treat water as the enemy. So if we treated carbon dioxide as the next largest gas, as the boogeyman, that is where carbon footprint came from. And carbon is in it's in so much, right? It's in all of the fuels, all of the hydrocarbons. It's in coal. It's in natural gas. It's in wood, right? It's in everything that we use. Anything that we use to make all of the products that we use that makes life so much better today has a carbon content. And when that's burned or released into the environment, you get carbon dioxide. Methane is what comes from cows, right? So once they decided that CO2 in the atmosphere wasn't enough, now they started going after cows, and by extension, now they don't want us to eat beef. They being the UN and the activist NGOs. This is where the attack on beef is coming from. You know, they'd rather have us eat printed beef, which unfortunately takes a whole lot more energy. I think that's the trade-off with a lot of this is, yes, we can synthesize this and we can make these in a factory, but it takes a whole lot of energy to do so. So the carbon footprint actually ends up being a lot worse than if we just do these naturally. So methane is the attack on cows, and then nitrous oxide is fertilizer. And so you're seeing this more in Europe than the US, but there's a big hit on using fertilizer to grow crops, and it's forcing a lot of farmers, off their land because they can no longer do things, economically. So there's a list of greenhouse gases. It's not just carbon dioxide. It's the whole list that you see on the slide. So continuing with the greenhouse gas protocol, Scope 4 was added in 2017, and you can read about Scope 4 on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol website. Not many people know about Scope 4. Scope 4 actually benefits UV and EB curing so fantastically. I mean, if there was a better example of Scope 4, it's UV and EB. So Scope 4 was meant to capture emissions or promote emissions reductions outside of Scopes 1, 2, and 3. So it was outside the value chain, outside the product life cycle. It was emissions in the value chain and the product life cycle. So it was supposed to support development and adoption of products with low emissions. So this is a completely fictitious example. I completely made this up. There was no data that I used to make this. I just wanted to illustrate how Scope 4 could be used. So if I was going to compare, a natural gas oven to a conventional mercury vapor lamp to an LED lamp, and if I looked at all of the greenhouse gases that were created during material acquisition and pre-processing, during the production of that equipment, during the distribution and storage, use, and end of life, if I knew how the greenhouse gases stacked up, if I was trying to make a purchase decision or promote a new product, I could compare that across several different products and see which one had a better lifetime greenhouse gas emissions portfolio. And for this completely fictitious example, because clearly I'm a little biased and I'm showing that UV LED is better than a mercury vapor and better than a gas dryer. And so I do think that if we actually put good solid numbers to this, in many cases, LED would prove to be, the ideal product for Scope 4 and a way to reduce emissions. So this takes us to environmental and social, governance. And this was introduced in 2005 through the PRI, and I'll explain how that happens in a second. But environmental social governance. So E is the environment that we are addressing through manufacturing processes, right? Lowering greenhouse gases, doing things more efficiently, making sure our products are environmentally friendly. The S is the social. This is where minimum wage laws, universal basic income, DEI, that all hits under the social. And then G for governments is redundant because all of this is captured under normal fiduciary policy anyway. But I think they just wanted to round it out and make it cover everything. So there you have ESG. So ESG scores are measured out of a score of 100. Buried within ESG is very much greenhouse gases. And so there are independent rating boards, just like you have independent credit agencies that will evaluate your credit score. There are independent rating agencies that evaluate the ESG scores for businesses as well as countries. And this is what the UN and the business community is doing to assess your business, as you assess your, vendors as to how sustainable they are. It's all wrapped up into this ESG score. Now, I Google ESG scores and man, they change a lot. And if you Google it from different organizations, the numbers are like all over the place. And one of the examples against ESG that's often used is, the country of Sri Lanka recently, had been given an ESG score of 98.1. They basically tried to implement all the sustainability policy. They banned fertilizers. They went all organic. They went cold turkey on their population. And while they probably had, other issues, beyond that, within 2 years, the country completely collapsed and went from an ESG score of 98.1 to 2, like overnight. So you have to take ESG scores with a grain of salt. There's a lot behind the numbers, and a high ESG score does not necessarily mean that you've got stability in that country or that company. So what is the PRI? So this is another one that I had no idea was even around. So as I mentioned, Kofi Annan handpicked a team of 20 people. It'd be no different than the executive directors or the president for any organization that you belong to, kind of handpicking a team to say, hey, we've got this project we want you to work on. We want you to go away. We want you to figure out how to roll ESG, which nobody was really talking about, roll ESG into the financial industries. So this team of 20 goes away, backed up by another 70 from activist NGOs and experts in the industry, and they come up with this pledge. It's a 6-statement pledge known as the Principles, and they launched it at the New York Stock Exchange in April of 2006. And probably not much fanfare. I mean, I don't remember them doing this at the stock exchange. I can't imagine there were many people that really paid attention to this. They probably rang the bell and the stock market opened and people didn't really think about it. But if you just read like 1, 2, and 3, it's, we will incorporate ESG issues into investment analysis and decision-making processes. We'll be active owners and incorporate ESG into our ownership policies and practices. And we will seek appropriate disclosure of ESG on the entities in which we invest. This was targeted at asset owners, investment managers, and service providers. So this is the banking industry. This is the investment industry. And what happened in 2008? We had the financial collapse. And so the PRI used that as an opportunity to go around and say, the banking industry is responsible for everything that happened in 2008. Ignore the fact that maybe there was some bad, government policy, but you're to blame. Wall Street killed Main Street. It would go a long way if you would sign this pledge. And so they convinced a lot. I mean, you look at the dates when people sign on. A lot of this comes 2008, 2009, 2010. They convinced almost the entire industry to sign on to the pledge. And I think a lot of banking and financial institutions did it thinking that it didn't really mean anything, right? Like, I'll sign my name, I'll sign this pledge, we'll market it as we're part of the PRI. Well, the bill's come due, right? The bill has come due. And today there are over 5,300 signatories to the Principles. Your bank is most likely one of them, right? So BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, those 3 institutional investment houses are managing your 401k, your pension, your investments, your mutual funds, right? And one of those 3, they're BlackRock, Vanguard, or State Street, one of those 3 is the single largest shareholder in 88% of the S&P 500 companies. And all of the institutional investors together own 80% of all stock, absolutely all stock. So what happens with publicly traded companies, when the votes come around, they're proxy voting your interests, and they've all signed on to the PRI. So this is exactly how ESG has rolled into, corporations, right? The people that work for these companies, the bankers, they talk to, the CEOs, the executive team at the companies that you work with or the companies that you're selling to, and they say, hey, look, this is important. We're a major shareholder. We think you need to put this on the agenda and this on, on the schedule. And that's how it gets rolled in. But the problem is that they couldn't force anybody to do it. It was just, Larry Fink from BlackRock has been promoting ESG for the last, 6, 7 years, and he's backed off a little bit because there's been some pushback. But what they did is they petitioned for legal enforcement, right? So they went to the UK, they went to the EU, they went to the US and said, we need some meat behind this, right? So one by one, each of these, the UK, the EU, the US passed legislation that requires publicly traded, and in many cases, large private companies to start reporting scope emissions, scope 1 and 2. In the case of Europe, scope 3. Now, In the UK, this applies to roughly 12,000 companies. In Europe, it's over 50,000. In the US, it's only about 2,800 because they knew they had to rein in it a little bit. Right now in the US, this only came out in March and it's currently under judicial review. It's probably going to be found unconstitutional. Basically, you have an alphabet agency in the SEC publishing a rule to the Federal Register that nobody voted on. Congress didn't vote on it. It's kind of, since FDR, we've had this growing overreach of the administrative state, and all the alphabet agencies have gotten really, really powerful. But there've been a lot of Supreme Court rulings in the past, few years that's kind of clipping back at this. And in the US, at least, it's probably going to be found unconstitutional. But it's still happening in Europe. And if you're selling into Europe and, you want to be part of the supply chain, you're going to be asked to report this information. So why are, the CEOs, one, now they're being told legally. But the other thing that's what's happening is that they don't want to be canceled, right? No one wants to be accused of a climate change denier. No one wants to be accused of a publicly traded company of not doing their part on sustainability. And they don't want to go to a board meeting and have, the environmentalist NGOs outside the front of that office tower protesting the CEO and the company for not doing their part. So the legal part of it actually gives them, the ability to say, well, now we're legally obligated to do this, right? It's not my decision. It's now law. So in 2015, and this is the last slide on that timeline, in 2015, the UN rewrote Agenda 2030. And that's why the year 2030 is what you always hear. You'll hear, on the extreme, people will say, oh, everything's going to end in 2030. But that's what it's coming from. The earth is not going to change, by 2030. The waters aren't going to boil and the sun's not going to explode and the temperatures aren't going to rise 10 degrees by 2030. It was just, a target date that they wanted to put these 17 sustainable development goals that you see on the right into action. And so this is what forms your ESG score. And you can dig deep into each one of these categories. There is a lot there. And it's all anchored at its core around greenhouse gas emissions. So how's this working in practice? Well, it's not. It is absolutely not working in practice. The PRI sold ESG and the principles to the financial community under the guise that it was going to reduce risk, right? If climate change was an existential risk, then you needed to invest in companies that were actually figuring out how to reduce their environmental and climate risk on their business. So they invested in clean tech, right? There's been trillions of dollars invested into green tech over the last 20 years, and the returns aren't there. So as an investor, you may have the socially conscious desire, to invest in clean tech, but it's not giving you the returns. And then when you look in practice, what's happening? Well, solar and wind is not environmentally friendly. It's not clean. It's becoming a disaster on the environment. It takes massive amounts of concrete and steel and oil, and it's killing birds. Like they have, in many cases, they have permits to kill up to 30% of the migratory animals that fly through the space, and sometimes they're exceeding it. It is causing problems on offshore, with the animals. I mean, the right whale in the Atlantic, if the wind farms continue, there's a good chance that those numbers are going to continue to contract. Will it become extinct? It's hard to say. But another problem with wind and solar is it's just not very energy dense. You need a lot of wind and solar to make up for each coal plant you shut down, for each natural gas plant that you don't build. And so we don't have enough energy, and we're running out of energy. And look at data centers. So like data centers, there are nearly 5,500 data centers in the US, and each data center pulls the same amount of electricity demand as 50,000 US households. So right now, today, with AI in its infancy and the industrial Internet of Things in its infancy and the fourth industrial revolution, all of that in its infancy, data centers now pull more power than every single house and apartment unit in the entire United States. And that's only expected to grow. And we can't do that with solar and wind. We just can't do it. Then you look at electric vehicles. So the PRI and the institutional investors convinced all of the big auto manufacturers to go all in on EV. And they agreed. Now, they knew their customers, they knew their market, yet they still agreed to go all in on e-vehicles, and they're losing money big time. So this is a classic case of following sustainability policy is not necessarily good for business. The automotive companies are now retracting. You know, they're pulling out of a lot of the projects. They're closing the plants where they were planning to build new SUV vehicles. Ford just announced it last week. I think BMW had an announcement a few weeks ago. Because they're not ready. They're absolutely not ready. So when ESG scores measure everything and you're constantly trying to improve your score, you're often implementing, you know, bad practices that aren't necessarily taking us where we need to go. So what's really going on? Well, what we have is a conflict of economic ideologies. Sustainability is trying to change the economic system under which we operate, and I don't think we talk about this enough. I listed 4 economic visions on this slide. There are many others, but you know, I chose 4. So vision 1, it's neoclassical economics. It's supply and demand. I make a product, you like my product, we agree on a price. If someone else comes along and I don't make more products, the price goes up because now you both want my product. If a competitor comes along and makes a better product at a cheaper price, you know, they get the business, right? Supply and demand, free market capitalism that we've known since the 1900s, early 1900s. Vision 2 is where I sit. I think where most of you on the webinar sit. Vision 2 is neoclassical economics, but doing it environmentally conscious. Make less waste, use more efficient processes, you know, make the best decision at every juncture so that everything we're doing is cognizant of the impact on the environment. I think that's where most of us sit. Vision 3 is the activist environmentalists. You know, this is the companies, the NGOs such as, you know, Greenpeace, it's Stop Oil Now, it's Extinction Rebellion. I mean, these are the ones you see on TV that are gluing themselves to bridges and throwing, you know, tomato soup on the Mona Lisa, right? They want no growth. They want us to be regressive. They want negative growth. And the problem is probably not the 3 that I mentioned, but there are activist environmentalists that are writing the policy that's coming at us through the UN. So vision 4, I think, is where all of this is shifting. And again, full disclosure, I'm squarely in camp of vision 2. But vision 4 is technocracy. And what we're seeing through the PRI, what we're seeing through ESG, what we're seeing through government policy is you're having, you know, this alignment, this globalization alignment between large corporations and the state, with a centralized command economy being driven by the UN. So command economies don't work. They didn't work in the Soviet Union, they didn't work in Cuba, and they didn't work in Venezuela. And I think what you're seeing here is a power grab by the UN on the piggyback sustainability policy, which is why they're promoting all sorts of sustainable technologies that aren't working and are actually harming the environment. So real quick wrap up here. This is where I'm going to kind of go into why UV makes sense. So if we're being told, based on the policy that's written, based on the policy that's being adopted, that sustainability is anchored in emissions, primarily greenhouse gases, but also VOCs, HAPs, and TAPs, then, you know, what do we do to incorporate this into our businesses while still remaining economically viable, still providing products that our customers, you know, want, and still creating an environment that makes it easier to live? I mean, the Earth is an inhabitable planet. It's not a livable one. What we do matters. Everything that you and everything that I do, everything that we do collectively makes life on this planet easier, and I don't want that to go away. So how do we look at everything we do on a day-to-day basis and make it more sustainable in terms of reducing emissions? Well, we can make our production processes more efficient. Now, I'm not against natural gas, but the legislation that's coming out is, so you can reduce or eliminate natural gas use at site. You can electrify everything and then use less electricity. You can eliminate or reuse solvents. Capture, repurpose waste heat, I think, is a big one. You can use lower temperature processes, reduce freight payloads and frequency, reduce scrap, and make ready. These are things that we can do together collectively that will lower greenhouse gases, because the electricity supply is not working. You cannot power industrial economies on solar and wind. I'm sorry, we can't. It's proving to be an outright failure, and it's destroying the grid. So we've got to find alternatives. It's not through the electricity supply. Transportation, 97% of what we do runs on diesel. Your freight, your earth moving equipment, your semis, your cargo ships, your planes. It's all jet fuel, diesel fuel. With the exception of small commutes with electric vehicles, the rest of it's not ready for prime time, and you're seeing projects get canceled. So everybody's been focusing on electrifying transportation. It's not a viable prospect. So we have to look at industrial processes because it's the only way we can have a significant impact. And the answer is not to look at breakthrough technologies that aren't scalable and aren't proven yet. So carbon capture and storage, by all means, if you want to devote resources to it, do. But it is not ready for prime time. There are a few pilot lines, but nobody's doing this successfully. You know, green hydrogen, we don't even have enough solar and wind power to power the grid as it is. Green hydrogen is based on the premise that you're only going to use solar and wind to convert water into hydrogen, and it takes more energy to do it than you get out of it. And electric batteries, I mean, I think if we wanted to back up the grid in the US, we would need, like on a conservative estimate, 6 months of battery storage. 3 months might be a little bit more realistic. We have 7 minutes. 7 minutes. We cannot make enough batteries to advance the technology enough to back up solar and wind power today. So you have to look at technologies that exist today that are proven, that are deployable, that are scalable, and that are affordable. And that's UV and EB. We need to promote this message because if you convert many of your manufacturing processes over to radiation curing, you have an immediate impact on a reduction in greenhouse gases. It eliminates scope 1 emissions, right? There's no hydrocarbons used in operation, no greenhouse gases, VOCs, HAPs, TAPs, 100% solid chemistry. It reduces scope 2 emissions because you're using less energy. It's all electric. It reduces your total installed system power. It means you need a smaller transformer. It means you're pulling less power off the grid. It reduces peak demand at startup. This is huge, and it's not very well understood. And one day I'm going to do a presentation just on how UV reduces peak demand, because that's what the generating plants care about. They don't care about your consumption. They can manage your consumption. Peak demand is when everybody comes in on Monday morning and starts their presses up at the same time. It pulls a massive amount of power off the grid, and they have to be able to supply that at any time that condition happens. Less consumption during operation, and it reduces carbon footprint because it's using less electricity. So, and that applies even for facilities that are already, consider themselves net zero. It also reduces scope 3 emissions. Reduce shipping of raw materials because we're no longer transporting solvents or water with the materials, 100% solid. So you ship less weight, less frequency, reduce raw material storage and warehousing. There's less packaging waste. Reduce formulation waste because it's 100% solids and we're using everything, reduce landfill wastes, and no wastewater treatment. So even scope 3 emissions and I showed you scope 4 earlier, and I do think that, LED and UV and EB are very good. So UV and EB have always been environmentally friendly, always, right? I can pull up presentations that I did in the 90s. The talking points were the same then as they are today. We're just messaging it a little bit different in terms of ESG and sustainability and greenhouse gases. So one quick slide, closing thoughts, and then I'll turn it over to Jeff in case there's any questions. And I want to reference something that I just saw on today. So there was a Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change published a report a week ago Friday. It was just a week ago, or just last Friday. It was the 22nd in the Journal of Science. And what they did is they evaluated 1,500 climate policy measures from 41 countries across 6 continents. And it was a detailed impact analysis of a wide-ranging climate policy measures over the last 2 decades. And what they found, out of 1,500 climate policy measures, only 63 had any impact on sustainability in the climate. 63. And on average, the average reduction in emissions was 19%. I mean, it's baffling. If everybody just converted to UV curing and EB and LED, we would produce better numbers than 19%. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. So the purpose of this presentation is I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm not asking you to take anything that I said straight. What I'm asking is that I think we need to start talking about this in a different way. Sustainability is not working, and don't think that there are some smart people somewhere in a room that have figured this all out and your company is just lagging. That's not the case. Nobody understands this. It's not producing the results that it was supposed to produce. And we've got an opportunity right now with UV and EB curing to change the conversation and promote technology that actually does have a positive impact on the environment. So last few slides here, just some references as some key points that I made in the presentation. If you want to read more on the SEC climate related disclosures rule, I did write an article that was in the last edition of the EB Technology magazine. You can access that online. And then a lot of the information I use, I pull from books. So I've got 3 slides here of books that I've found relevant that I think provide insight into what's happening. This history of sustainability on the left, it only goes through 2014, but I think it's a great introduction if you want to really understand, how we got here. And then the race to zero, how ESG investing will create the global financial system, I think is, well, all of these are important. They all bring something different to the table. So I encourage you to just get some additional information, because what we're getting at conferences, what we're seeing in the trade journals, it's just more and more of the same, and we're all copying off the kid next to us that pretty much doesn't know what he's doing either. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jeff, and we'll open it up for questions.
All right, Jennifer, thank you very much for the presentation. That was great. I do have a question here that will run by before we get off here. Jennifer, how do we communicate to, let's say, corporate management if you're wanting to communicate the importance of the situation with sustainability? Any tips on that, on how to communicate that to the corporate
So I think this is an incredibly important question, because I give aspects of this talk, and I have conversations with people all the time, and if I don't get questions during the presentation, I'll get lots of people that come up with me afterwards and they'll say, yeah, I completely agree. I'm on board. We're on the same page, but I can't say anything at work. Like, I don't feel comfortable raising these positions. This is what the owner wants. This is what the CEO wants. This is what the board wants. And you can see through the PRI, if you're a publicly traded company, you can see, how this is permeating corporate organizations. We have to talk about this. Right? Sustainability is not accomplishing what it was meant to accomplish. It's not helping the climate. It's becoming disastrous on the environment. It's mothballing industrial companies and deindustrializing the modern world. And it's making it very hard for the middle class and the poor to get by. Everything is going up. And I know there's other reasons why things are going up. But if you're making products more expensive, let's take a look at what brings people out of the third world. So if you're a third world nation and you're getting by, the number one thing that will improve your standard of living is clean water. Absolutely, hands down, improves your health, keeps you from getting sick, allows you to cook. Clean water is number one. The next thing is a method of transportation, whether that's a horse or a bicycle or a motorbike or a car. Having means to transportation gives you access to more opportunities. It allows you to go further. It allows you to pursue things that are not within your immediate, walking environment. And then the third thing is clean, reliable, plentiful, affordable energy. And we've been blessed in the US and Europe to have had that my entire life and beyond. And I'm grateful for that. And what we're doing is putting all of that. It's all going to be in jeopardy. I mean, we already have rolling blackouts coming. So my advice on that question is, don't think that everybody's got it figured out. Yeah, maybe there are some legislation, some policies that's gotten certain executives a little bit compromised. And yes, maybe they don't want to be canceled by the activist NGO environmentalists. But we've got to create environments where people feel comfortable to talk about this, because we tackled pollution, right? We did that in a very short amount of time. Not saying it's gone, but we figured out the smog's gone, right? LA is not the LA of the 60s. You can actually see the sky. Can we do better? Absolutely. But we only get there if we start talking about it and start challenging each other on these ideas, because what's being rolled out now and the amount of government money that's subsidizing and funding things that are not helping is problematic. So I would say we need to start talking about it. Don't be afraid to bring it up in meetings. Yeah, maybe the first time you get some people that roll their eyes or maybe some comments. But the more you talk, the more I talk, the more it encourages other people to talk, and then collectively we've got more people talking about it, because we do want to take care of, we want to be good stewards of the environment, right? We want clean air, we want clean water. Yeah, climate change is this mystery that we don't understand, but there are things that we are doing that can not harm it. I think we need to figure out what that is, and unfortunately today we just don't understand it. So doing more of a bad thing isn't going to help. Just not.
I think that's good information, Jennifer. I think we're pretty much out of time here. Jennifer mentioned if anybody has questions for her directly, you see her email and her mobile number on the screen here, so feel free to reach out to Jennifer. Jennifer, thank you very much for joining us for our EB Technology Magazine webinar series today, and we'll talk soon. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.